So let's get started. So some brief chapter updates, and then I'll let Joe get into his presentation. Like I said, we recently got rid of the CSA Circle page. If you've been around with CSA for a while, you would have been registered with this old outdated website that was called the Circle page. And that's where most of the communications went through for the chapter. Now we are 100% on the LinkedIn page and Slack. So CSA Global has moved us over to their public Slack. We don't have individual chapter Slacks just yet, but there is a publicly available Slack for all of CSA Global, and everybody can join. All CSA resources are free, so you can log in, you can sign up, you can get access to research groups and different publications. They just recently released their AI controls matrix, which I've been using internally and with some other groups that I've been talking to lately. All of it is free and available. They do have training, which is paid for training. You can also find that on the main CSA Global website. And what I'm trying to do is get more tokens throughout the year. So as we do happy hours, as we do webinars, I can get some certification tokens, and then you can get free access to things like the CCSK, the CCZT, and they have an AI security certification coming up here pretty soon as well. So outside of that, the chapter specifically, we brought on a sponsorship coordinator in the last 30 days. Her name is Heather Sprung. She works for GuidePoint. And we're also already working on our happy hour, which is going to be in April 9th at the North Shore Tavern. Right, Justin? We're good there. Usually have about 20, usually have about like 20, 25 people show up for that. Free food, free drinks, and lots of networking opportunities and conversation.
From 6 to 8 p.m.
6 to 8 p.m.
Yep.
And then if they don't kick us out after 8 p.m., then it's 8 p.m. until whenever you want to leave. Yeah. We tried to get the April one going because we know the NFL draft is coming in later in April. So we tried to get in early April, and we got time set up. We'll probably have another happy hour within a couple months as well. Anything I missed that you want to throw in there, Justin or Annie, before we hand it over to Joe?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, all good there. Like I said, I'm going to hand this off to Joe. He's got his presentation today, talk about specifically shared responsibility model and all the fun that comes with it. I'm going to throw some links to our chapter LinkedIn, the public CSA Slack, some research groups, and some AI articles that just came out that I want to share with the rest of the group. All right, off to you, Joe.
Thanks, Eric, and good morning, everybody. The topic today, not necessarily anything new or groundbreaking, but one that is critical to the cloud and a bit of a different take on it, I hope, that will at least keep people interested, which is the shared responsibility model. And we're going to cover a couple of different things that are important with cloud engagements and that really still continue to be true, even as the cloud has become a little bit more of a mature technology, is no longer something that's a bit new. Obviously, the path is well treaded or well tread, and so we'll get into it. Next slide. So a little bit about me: degrees, letters, and certifications. This is not a resume that I am trying to use to get people to listen to me. This is an attempt to get people to listen to what I have to say and to make up their own mind afterwards as to whether or not all of these things matter in terms of whether or not what I'm saying is right or wrong or accurate. I don't use these. I say this at the beginning of all of my presentations because I don't like to sort of use the things that are on this slide as a reason that people should do what I tell them to do. There are plenty of people out there who are well educated, well credentialed, and will steer you in the completely wrong direction. I'd like to hope I'm not one of them. You will notice that my board position in the Cloud Security Alliance Pittsburgh chapter is not on here. And there is a really good reason for that, and I would get into it, but instead, let's go to the next slide. So just a couple of quick things on the agenda, going to keep it short, sweet, and to the point. We will kind of go through a little bit about what the shared responsibility model is and sort of some of the key points that matter in any cloud engagement. the different types of cloud engagements, of course, so that we can differentiate between them. We will take a look at some of the different shared responsibility models for some of the bigger players in the cloud industry. And finally, we will cover a couple of things that are really important when it comes to the contract signing and some other things that I'm hoping to address as far as common pitfalls that we see in things like sales conversations, negotiations, etc. So essentially, what is the cloud shared responsibility model? So it is more or less a model that will show you all of the different responsibilities that you are responsible for and that your cloud your cloud security provider or your cloud services provider is responsible for. So ultimately, they vary based on the type of cloud engagement, from infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. But there are some things that are always going to be your responsibility and other things that are always going to be their responsibility. And then, of course, the stuff in the middle is fluid between the two based on which type of engagement that you're involved in. But it's the ones that are ultimately the customer's responsibility that I'm going to focus on a little bit today, given the fact that they are the ones that are very important to be noteworthy of and aware of, because no matter what type of engagement you have, they're going to be on your plate. And also, no matter what somebody else tells you, they're going to be on your plate. Next slide. So just again, very quick about the three models. We have infrastructure, platform, and software. Infrastructure is essentially if you would decide to offload your data center that you have on-prem and move it into the cloud. You have a lot more control of things like the operating system, of the virtualized hardware specifications. You can sort of turn up and turn down things as you need to take advantage of things like scalability or high availability, or maybe you only need fast computing power once a month or once every week even. And so you can kind of make sure that you're paying for what you're using and not more, rather than having to invest in all of the hardware, electricity costs, utility costs, all of the HVAC systems, et cetera, that go in with a traditional data center. Of course, in this regard, you also have the most responsibility for basically setting up all of the networking, all of the machines, hardening and securing them, making sure that all of your data is properly secured as well, whether it is within those devices or on something like an S3 bucket or offline storage that is connected to those machines, etc. Platform is kind of in the middle. Really, this gives you control over everything on the machine, but really has pre-built machines that you can just sort of spin up and spin down as you need to. Oftentimes, you'll see that whenever people are developing, testing, and getting ready to deploy software applications so they can test their code. The good thing about this is that it allows them to specify the specs for the machines that they need. The bad thing about this is that they often will create backdoors in order to get into their code in development and make it easier to do, and oftentimes forget to close them. And so it makes the machines more vulnerable, and of course the code more vulnerable in production once it's finally launched. But that is actually not a cloud specific problem. That's something you would see even in a traditional developed within your own infrastructure. And finally, software as a service, we're all familiar with. We see this as basically, we only see the front end of the application. So typically it's a web application, but it could potentially be a desktop application. Everything is controlled and hosted by the provider. They manage everything from the hardware and software on the back end. They do all the maintenance, the patching, the changes, etc. All you have to do is access the application and manage a couple of key components that we will look at as we get into the shared responsibility model. Everybody's got one. So in this case, they are different and yet the same. So we're going to look at three of them today, just as the big players that they are. So Amazon Web Services, of course, being the first one, and this is the shared responsibility model that they have. And as you can see, it differentiates between a couple of key things. You see the customer stuff at the top and the AWS stuff at the bottom. This is one of the main ones that you'll see, in the industry, and especially if you're using AWS, this is the one that they use to govern their shared responsibility model. I'm going to go through all three of them before I start to hit on some of the similarities and the differences between them. So actually, if we can go to the next one. Like I said, they all have one. Here's one for Google. Notice with the Google one, by the way, that they differentiate between the type of engagement in addition to the fact that they have the different responsibilities between the customers. So just something to noteworthy there. But actually, if we go to the next one, which will be Microsoft, You can see that they also do some color coding and a little bit easier, similar to comparing price plans for something like a subscription-based service, where the higher the cost, the better the subscription. However, in this case, it's really just showing you that there are customer and cloud service provider responsibilities that are broken down between the IP and SaaS engagements. And as you get further into the SaaS, you have the least amount of responsibility as the customer. Also, you rely on the cloud service provider for the most stuff. So you are depending on them for, like I said, change management and having proper maintenance windows that will not disrupt your business, for things like high availability, for things like backup and archiving of your data in their data centers, if that's something that you're not using a third-party service for. And data is one of the things that we're going to hit on here as far as a customer responsibility in a moment. But it's important to note that one of the things that you saw probably in all three of these is that your data and access to the front-end application, so even if it's in a SaaS application, these are the two things that are really going to be critical. No matter what type of cloud engagement that you have, these are going to be on your responsibilities. And the other things, like I mentioned, so the underlying hardware, for example, and having it secured in its data center is always going to be on the cloud side of things. You're never going to have access to the hardware, at least not besides the virtual hardware. But like I said, the data and the access is always something on your side, regardless of what they tell you during negotiations, regardless of what any email or phone call has uncovered. Those are things that are going to matter. And once we go to the next slide, we will get a little bit further into why and how. So ultimately, what this is going to come down is this. Your contract is your absolute key. If it's not in the contract, it doesn't exist, regardless of what they promised you on the phone, via email, in person, etc. They can promise you the world. They can tell you that their tools will do everything. They can tell you that you can integrate all of your current tooling into their environment. But if it's not in the contract whenever you sign it, it doesn't exist. That is something that we see a lot, unfortunately, when you sort of transition from sales over to implementation. Not unique to cloud and not unique to one particular company. In this case, though, I pointed out because we want to make sure that when we are signing this contract, all of the things that we need to be there are there, that we don't get sort of locked into this particular vendor, or that we risk getting locked out of the vendor if they would go out of business or if they would suspend the service, that we couldn't get to our data in an accessible way that would allow us to migrate it or port it over to a different cloud service provider, or maybe move it on-prem if we so chose. And that's why open standards is something that's important. You know, if they have some proprietary database that they store your data in and only their tools can see it, and you cannot easily open it in something like Oracle or SQL Server or MySQL, then it could be something where you could potentially lose access to your data. And of course, they could use that against you in leverage when it comes to contract negotiations, or again, if they would go out of business or their service was discontinued, you would find yourself in an unpleasant position. The other thing is that you are responsible for your data, and that includes everything. So data backups might be something that is being done by the cloud service provider, but do not automatically assume that they are doing it, or automatically assume that if you need a recovery of something that they can provide it. So having another backup provider or solution in place is something that's going to be very important. It is exceptionally important in the infrastructure and even the platform as a service. But again, when you have software as a service, still being able to have a backup of your data in an open and accessible format is going to be critical, and is something that you want to make sure that you do have memorialized in the contract that is signed, and something that's enforceable, just like you would have your service level agreements, just like you would have your recovery point and recovery time objective for BCPDR, just like you would have all of these other things in the contract. The other thing that is just as important is access to the application. So making sure that the people that are provisioned access, even whenever the initial access might be provisioned by the provider in a software as a service model, for example, making sure that you're doing access management same as you would on-prem. So all of the Kane principles apply. Least privilege, segregation of duties, all of these important things that you would do in a desktop application also apply to your cloud services. You want to make sure that you're not giving people too much access. You want to make sure that you're not giving people the ability to sort of send a transaction fully through the life cycle of a transaction, if you will, without oversight. And you also want to make sure that you're not just having a bunch of admin accounts sitting out there that, if they would be compromised, could in fact allow your environment to be compromised, because when we're talking about cloud infrastructure or even cloud-based applications, we're typically talking web infrastructure, or we're at least talking publicly available infrastructure or publicly accessible infrastructure. That means that while your data centers might be restricted and you have to have the right IP ranges or VPN into the network, et cetera, with the cloud, you typically don't have those same restrictions. And so while it is nice because it allows you to access it from anywhere, it is also dangerous because that means that anyone else can access it from anywhere as well. And even though you might lock down the internal environment by things like IP or firewall restrictions or segmentation using VLANs and stuff like that, if you have infrastructure as a service, as an example, it still doesn't necessarily mean that the application is completely protected. So doing things like vulnerability scans, pen tests, where of course you're permitted to do so and have a signed contract with the cloud provider that allows these things. Otherwise, you might be potentially violating their terms of service, and you might find out that there are consequences for that, including service disruptions or cancellations. And so by all means, make sure that you have everything in place before you engage in any kind of vulnerability testing or pen testing with this infrastructure. It's not your own, even if you're paying for it, and it is something that you could potentially risk. The other thing that's important is trust. So typically, if any case would go to court, unless there is a demonstrably terrible negligence on the part of the cloud service provider, the courts are going to tell you that you are responsible for your customers' data. That means that if something happens in the cloud and customer data is leaked, the courts are typically going to side with the cloud services provider and tell you that you are responsible for the protection of that data, for the backup and maintenance of that data, et cetera. That goes back to the least privileged access. That also goes into the importance of making sure that you are taking due diligence and care of your client data the same as you would for your internal infrastructure. In addition to the actual courts, there is, of course, the court of public opinion. And generally speaking, whenever the front page news comes out that a particular data breach took place, you're not going to see the cloud services provider where the data was stored. You're going to see the name of the company that is yours. And the reason for that is if I am a customer and I entrust you with my data, and you then entrust somebody else with my data, possibly without telling me, it is still going to be my expectation that you have ensured that that data is at least as secure as I would have expected it to be, if not more so. More so is great. As secure is good. Less secure is certainly problematic. And like I said, you will struggle to see a lot of sympathy from the courts and even less sympathy from the court of public opinion. Finally, I just wanted to touch a little bit on the fact that backups, I know I've hit on it before, but it is something that you can do even with another cloud services provider, or if you're going to do it, make sure that it's protected. Want to have your entire storage solution sitting in an S3 bucket that is world readable, for example, in AWS. And it sounds silly enough, but it's happened before and very likely will happen again, where people are just crawling the AWS infrastructure, looking for anything that is world readable so that they can get access to it and also steal that information. It maybe isn't as effective as ransomware, where it would lock out the information. And of course, now you have to pay them to get it back. But certainly for blackmail purposes or just to cause havoc for your company by leaking the information or selling it on the dark web would all be things that could be possible. Next. So I know that I went through this pretty quickly. I know that there is not a ton of, like I said, new ground to be broken here. I suspect this is a concept most cloud people are familiar with at this point in 2026. But I hope that I at least hit on some of the key points. And again, the data and access management points being the customer responsibility, being the ones that I really wanted to take away, because no matter how many engagements I've worked on that were cloud-centric or cloud-based, there are always misconceptions about that based on different things that people have been told, oftentimes by people who are not qualified to tell them that. But of course, if you are interested, you can scan the QR code on your screen, which is definitely not a virus, and find me on LinkedIn. I am happy to debate this with you all day. I am an avid learner of this industry, and that's what drives me to get up in the morning, come into work every day, is learning new things. So by all means, feel free to reach out and have conversations. Feel free to come up to me at the happy hour on April 9th, as Eric mentioned earlier, and have conversations. I will gladly engage. And even now, if anybody has any questions, I'm open to that.
I have a question, Joe.
Sure.
I'm going to go back a couple slides here too.
Yep.
We talked a lot about access management and what the responsibility between the customer and the hosting provider, like let's say the most common aspect is using something that's SaaS based. You're typically putting access management, accounts, identities, and identity and directory infrastructure in your responsibility where you share technology with the provider itself. But if you get in a situation where they have their own identity and directory infrastructure, you want to either bring your own or validate what they are doing in their directory infrastructure. What are some things that you could do to make sure that their identity infrastructure is up to par with the controls that you accept as an organization?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So typically what I would tell people is before you sign anything, do your due diligence, just as you would with your third-party service providers. Cloud service providers are no different. Make sure that you are asking them sort of key questions based on your security controls around your own access. Make sure you're asking for things like independent attestation. So maybe they have a SOC 2 Type 2, maybe they have an ISO 27001 or either ISO certification. And those things, of course, give you a little bit more assurance that they are doing the things that you would expect them to do. And if you either have the requirement to do so or you would like a little bit more sort of ongoing peace of mind, write it into the contract that you have the opportunity to perform these assessments on such an annual basis, maybe biannual basis, whatever it might be. Making sure that you understand their authentication mechanisms, what sort of protocols that they're using, if they have sort of SAML-based SSO federated authentication solutions in place, sort of understanding what that looks like, and understanding also what sort of the creation or revocation of access looks like too. So one of the things that often happens in SaaS solutions is that they are publicly accessible, meaning that you don't necessarily have the sort of benefit of being able to revoke somebody's Active Directory account or their main Windows account or their main Linux account if you're a business that uses Linux instead, when they're behind your organization's sort of perimeter, if you will. So typically, if I take away your key to the front door, it doesn't still matter that you might have a key to the room inside the house. With cloud, you don't really have that front door key. Basically, I can go to a website in a web browser on any of my computers, even my personal one, and I can get to that URL. Not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, that's true. And as long as I still have my credentials, I can log in. So when you are potentially terminating somebody for a high-risk termination, let's say, you don't want them to be able to access that for a couple of days from that termination. You want to make sure that access is revoked right away. If you depend on the provider to do access management, you would then have to submit a request to them and hope that they honor it in a certain amount of time, which does go back to the SLA thing that I mentioned in the contract, and that they understand that there is an SLA behind that. However, ceding that control over your access management solution to them may not be desired or preferred, because if somebody is terminated, you could potentially revoke their access almost immediately if you're able to do it in-house. So like I said, either find out if you can still have sort of a high degree of control over access management, or if they are somebody that is going to manage the provisioning and deprovisioning of access for you, make sure at the very least that you have assessed the controls that they have into place for it. Also that you've sort of memorialized everything in contract as far as SLAs and your ability to do further due diligence on that in the future, so that if they should make any changes, you'll at least be aware of them. Because of course we see, protocols come and go as often as we do. We find vulnerabilities in them that require updating, etc. We want to make sure that if we would do that on-prem, that they're going to do it for us in the cloud. You don't necessarily have the leverage to force them to do it when you're talking about the big cloud players like we are here today, but you can certainly hope that they will do the proper thing and get whatever in the contract you feel comfortable with, and work hard to negotiate to ensure that your best interests are taken care of to the extent that you can as you're negotiating.
Annie, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Eric. Joe, my question with the shared responsibility model ties in kind of the introduction of AI, I'll say agentic agents, as well as, a lot of companies starting to build their own language models. I'm just curious in your thoughts of, do you see in the industry this shared responsibility model still being applicable in the framework of AI? Do you think there would be a different shared responsibility model as it relates to AI technologies? Right, understanding, a large language model, you get a bunch of data, so arguably you could say that's PaaS IaaS depending on the technology. But I'm just kind of curious your thoughts with the evolution of a generative AI as well as agentic AI, what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, so I'm working on a presentation actually much more focused on that subject, not just AI in the cloud, mind you, but AI in general and some of the pitfalls that we see. And I haven't recorded it yet, but it's top of mind for me just because I just put together the deck pretty recently. And I will say that my warnings to people about AI are this: it flips the data model on its head. It used to be only give them the data that is absolutely necessary for them to accomplish whatever it is that we're asking them to do. The cloud was a little bit different because, if especially in the IaaS model, you essentially might move all your data to the cloud if your data center exists there. So whether it's your databases, your flat files, your unstructured data, et cetera, they're going to be there. But in SaaS, they only have the data that would be maybe necessary for that particular application. However, now with AI being what it is, a lot of these AI companies, either the ones that develop the large language models or the ones that are using them, have kind of shifted from give us what we just absolutely need to give us as much as you're possibly willing to so that we can make our model work better for you. It's a great marketing campaign, but the key to that then is to make sure that the data is good. And I have been at so many different organizations where I find outdated records on SharePoints or sitting on OneDrive sites, et cetera, which is still SharePoint if you want to get down to it, or vice versa. I always forget which is which. But that being said, there's a lot more need for these data elements to be out there to train these LLMs to do what you're asking them to do and to make them work for you. So having a good data set that isn't reliant on out of date or stale or conflicting data is a critical thing in any AI infrastructure. The thing where I think it matters in the cloud is making sure that the data is protected against being sort of ingested into the LLM and then they can't get it back. I always tell people AI is kind of a data monster and there's one giant stomach where all the data is kind of churned together in teaching the LLM. Some of the models do have like an enterprise version that will let you use only your particular data. But again, that's talking specifically about your own AI engagements. If you have a cloud-based AI engagement, it can be difficult even to know if they're using AI because a lot of times it's not going to be as obvious as something where if they were using a particular software, you might see that the runtime environments out there like Java or .NET, or that they're using something like Spring or Bouncy Castle or Log4j, hopefully not. And it gets a little bit more blurry. And the thing of it is even with something like social media engagement, you see that on a lot of web pages where there's the buttons where you can share things to Facebook or X or Instagram or whatever it might be. With AI, a lot of it is basically baked into the website. So there's no easy way to block those elements from those web pages in all cases. And I think that's great from the company's perspective because everything is sort of unique and native to their own atmosphere or their own ecosphere, if you will. But from a perspective from security and from understanding what you have there and what you don't, it can be very difficult to distinguish between the two. And once that data has kind of left your organization and has been loaded into one of these LLMs and training these agents, and now these agents are in production, there is a real risk of not being able to get it back. Because of course we are focused on functionality first and security later. It's why SSH, came after Telnet. It's why SFTP came after FTP. And it's a lesson we don't learn from, unfortunately, because security is overhead and marketing wants to be the first to market and have the first out the door. And it's a balance that has to be seen. But, it's our job as security practitioners and as cloud practitioners to make sure that all of the safeguards and controls around our data, classification, labeling, handling, et cetera, both in transit and at rest are there. And that the engagement that we're in again, kind of as Eric alluded to before, will allow us to secure at least as much as we would on-prem and at least as much as our own internal requirements ask you to do.
Yeah, just want to interject a comment and then you can go, Brandon. When I think of shared responsibility modeling, when it comes to use of LLMs and use of AI in any kind of situation, SaaS, PaaS, or IaaS, really doesn't matter. The jury is still kind of out on who's ultimately responsible for data that goes into the LLM and the output of the LLM itself. But then more on the identity side, I threw in the chat, like my thoughts around specific identity is more focused now on non-human identity, where it's been around for a while. We've been using keys over usernames and passwords for a very long time. It's already proliferated within the cloud environment, but now the responsibility turns into how to manage those non-human identities a little bit better, because that's going to be the total future. And when you look at shared responsibility modeling now, especially for the big hosting providers, you can see where things map directly to human identity, but managing the non-human identity, the keys, the tokens, everything else, all the API access is going to be your responsibility in the end. Even if it's something that's generated outside of your responsibility, that's generated and used in AWS, for example, if you're using a native SaaS applications API, it's your responsibility to make sure that it's least privileged and controlled correctly. So the lines get a little blurred when you're not talking about specifically human identity, but if you just default for now, responsibility is always retained by the customer. Make sure that it is secured on your side first before you accept that pathway or that authentication method.
And there is some court precedent to that, actually. So there was a case, Moffat versus Air Canada. And basically what happened was they had a funeral, so they couldn't take their flight. And they were interacting with Air Canada's AI agent, and they were asking for a refund, and the AI agent promised them one. And they actually did provide a link to the policy, but of course, because they promised them the refund, the person did not click that link. Air Canada's argument was if they had clicked the link, they would have seen that actually we don't offer refunds in these situations. However, the Canadian court said that an AI agent responding to you on behalf of the company is to be treated as a customer service representative responding on behalf of you. So essentially, if a human says it, it's going to be honored, and if an AI agent says it's going to be honored. And that's essentially the precedent for that. Where it does get a little bit sticky is if there is an AI agent elsewhere that maybe has been trained on my data but is not a part of my organization, and if it provides a response, then the developer of that AI agent or that LLM is going to say, well, you can blame the person who provided the data. And the person who provided the data is going to say, but I have no control over how the LLM works, so it's their fault. That's the one I think we're going to see a very interesting play out of that, if you will, because I think that it's going to be a matter of finger pointing, and it's going to be interesting to see how sort of the legality of that sort of falls down.
Agreed.
And I'll be curious to see how it plays out, but it'll be messy for a while.
Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking through, the shared responsibility question from Annie, and an example would be more of, let's say you're using Microsoft Foundry to architect and engineer a solution for a customer, and they want you to develop them a chatbot for their customers to use. And so you're basing that whole infrastructure on Microsoft's cloud, and they're going to give you the tools to do whatever you want to do. They're going to give you the models. They're going to give you, everything you need to secure it or restrict what is capable, what the customer can do with that. But ultimately, it's on you, the owner of the application that's being developed, that has that chatbot, to configure the things like content filters, block lists, what input filtering, basically, input and output filtering. And so that ultimately controls whether or not the customer of the example application can log in and use the chatbot to order their next meal or solve a software development question using that model. So ultimately, I think there is that example of a shared responsibility model where the cloud provider, the solution provider, gives you the tools, and you as the owner of the application have to go through and configure it and harden it, and only allow it to do what you want it to do for your customers. So there's that 3 tiers of, you got the end user, you got the owner of the application, and the cloud provider.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's some things that I've seen where maybe you're using kind of like, if we use your example, like a Microsoft hosting environment. But if you decide to partner with, like, let's say a third party to host in your Azure environment, how are those logs for agents, as an example, like a human invoking an agent? Who's responsible for ensuring generation of those types of logs? And if you're using AI Foundry as an example, or even like, APIM, or, some of the other like Defender suite of tools, in terms of this Microsoft conversation, what I've seen from a practitioner's view is that the maturity of like ticking and tying all that may not necessarily be there. And so the question kind of delves into like, well, who's really responsible for ensuring, one, that capability is there? Two, when you're taking, a third-party solution and picking your hosting environment, are you expecting that third party to make sure that they can host in a cloud environment and that they have the right type of, like, I'll say, standard logs, whether it be for IT availability or security practices? And so what we're kind of finding is like, well, how do I tick and tie with the adoption of AI? And a lot of people are using cloud for that, right? To get more compute faster. How do you rectify that shared responsibility model between, a third party, your hosting provider, and yourself as someone that has to support it? I think, at least the chair that I sit in, I find it quite difficult to figure out who has a legal obligation to make sure it's there versus like a new technology where maybe the maturity of that technology is not quite there for some of the security controls. And then who are we really expecting to kind of own that? Because there is a little bit of a blurriness I find in this space. And that's just, I think it's just more of like a maturity thing of, as these new technologies are proven out by people using them, I think there'll be some natural progression of thought with the shared responsibility model. But that's kind of what I've been seeing. Austin, I see kind of a shake over there too. Maybe I can hold my thoughts there for a moment, give you the floor there to kind of weigh in.
I don't know. When I hear AI, I think about like, what's the foundation that you're building upon? And kind of like the question I was going to ask was slightly different here with shared responsibility, but with AI is more like, I think of things from like a baseline perspective, is how do you set the baseline for security, right? So if I look at, the CIS top 20 controls, what does that tell me to do from just a generic security practitioner standpoint? And then how do I apply that to like, an IaaS, type environment? But then how do I apply that even more focus to give a framework for people to be allowed to go run off with AI and give them guardrails to, kind of enable them to be successful, right? But I think, the part that I always struggle with is, okay, how do you set that initial baseline? Like you get a cloud account, right? Like take a step back, you get this IaaS cloud account, what are those top like 10 things you should be doing and setting from day one? And I think like cloud providers kind of, fail us a little bit up front, where they don't really guide you through that process to be like security at the forefront. They just say, hey, here's your environment. It's up to you as the, cloud account owner or the engineer to kind of do your own thing and set your standards, versus helping you set those standards up front. Say, hey, yeah, you maintain all of this. Here's all the extra 10 things you need to do. And I think AI just complicates it a little bit more, where you start saying like, hey, I have this chatbot, I need some sort of guardrail in place to kind of protect user input. Well, it's like, okay, well, are you too late at that point? Because like nothing guided you to miss that guardrail at some point. People are overlooking like the simple things. But I'm kind of curious from like a CSA perspective, like as a new IaaS consumer, like the question in my mind is, how do I set my organizations up for success from day one of getting the cloud account to have the basic standards in place. So then you can have those more mature conversations later on. Are you guys aware of any type of like playbooks or run books that, organizations are using to say, hey, as a cloud, user or owner, here's the top 10 things thou shall do to be setting yourself up for success? Like I think about like cloud tagging as a baseline maturity. Upon resource creation, we, instantly create a tag based on who created that resource, right? Just as an example, but yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on that specifically. From the CSA side, the AI controls matrix as a basis of things like governance requirements and ISO 42001, which is also an AI risk management framework. So you'll see things like that when you dig into more of the AI resources, and I linked a couple in there for you to take a look at CSA specific. But if we take just like a technical aspect, baseline controls, I mapped out a couple key areas that you always want to think of, and then I'm going to add on to that. Data protection, always data protection. You are responsible for your data, regardless. No matter what goes into that prompt, what comes out of that prompt and goes into your storage or goes into your processing for your LLM, that is your responsibility. So just kind of default to that for now until more of the legalities come out, like Annie's talking about natural progression. And I'm not going to speak to anything legal specific or privacy related because that's not my realm and that's not my responsibility here. A big thing that I think a lot of groups will have to start thinking about more so is, what is your prompt engineering? How are you designing and developing guardrails around your prompt engineering, and how are you getting your developers and getting your non-developers to understand what prompt engineering and secure prompt engineering actually is? Because in the past we had just groups of developers that have been practicing this thing, that have their own guardrails, that know what's happening when they're doing programming. Now we have prompt engineering coming from every single type of user. So taking a step back on culture and taking a step back on looking at security awareness training and things like that for prompt engineering is huge. There's actually a couple of books that I've been recently reading, and they're all around vibe coding and AI security. And they give you the basics, they give you the high levels: protect your data, secure your prompts, and then also think about access and trust with partners. And so that's my last point. If you are a big company and you're using Foundry in Microsoft, or maybe Palantir's Foundry or some other Foundry type AI approach that you're going to be developing software and systems into, take the data protection first. You might also be integrating LLMs with other groups, right? So make sure trust in your entire lifecycle and your entire pipeline of building these things is established first. Don't go off with a one-off AI company that you can't really trust. You don't really have that validation with the things that they're doing from a security aspect. Try for vendors and suppliers that you are better able to trust. And like Joe said, there's things like the SOC 2 reports, ISO 27001, 42001 is specific to AI. A lot more companies are starting to go in that direction. You're going to gain trust through some of the things that they're saying in those reports, but also in what they are going to be integrating within your systems. Microsoft Foundry is a great example because I think at this point, pretty much everybody can trust that Microsoft is not going away anytime soon. So you're not going to lose that capability, but your responsibility is still on the data, the access control, your prompt engineering, and defining your own guardrails. That was a long-winded way of saying just do those 4 things now, because that's what you should be focusing on.
And it's not that there's nothing. I mean, so NVIDIA, for example, has their NEMO guardrails for things like chatbots. And there are other tools out there, and Eric just mentioned like the ISO standards. There's the NIST AI risk management framework. There's the CSA AI controls matrix now. And I think that, as we develop, it's just going to be important to have an approach. A lot of anything that you're going into. When the cloud first became a thing of sort of import and experience and excitement, there were a lot of conferences taking place, and the CEO or the CFO would come back and say, "We're going to the cloud." And it would demonstrate a lack of understanding in exactly what the cloud was, and the IT team would try and explain it, and it would say, I didn't ask for an explanation, I asked for an action. They hear about the cost savings, they hear about this, and not the technical things. And so we need to make sure that before it even gets to the point where you're using AI within your organization, that you have a very defined and detailed plan that you are sort of aware of exactly what you want that AI to do, and also that you know what it should and shouldn't do. If I use Copilot for GitHub to write code for me, I'm still responsible for that code. So it's still important that I check it, that I make sure it's secure, that I run it through my SaaS testing tools, that I peer review it, whatever I need to do. It's no different than if you use a Java library that you didn't write. You're still using somebody else's code. It's still your responsibility to make sure that code is secure, that code is dependable, that it has good performance management, that it's not, susceptible to things like buffer overflow, etc. Now you have things like prompt poisoning and all these other new AI specific attacks coming out, and they're a little bit harder to guard against because, especially with chatbots, by their very nature, they're supposed to be conversational. So they're not expecting a static input and providing a static output. And so it does become a little bit more challenging, but that does not absolve us of our responsibility to do it.
Great. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody jumping on today. We're hoping to have a few more of these types of webinars, get some groups of people together where we can highlight a key topic, especially ones that CSA has a lot of resources around, and then diving into more discussion. So after this, we'll share a bit of the materials and some of the notes with the rest of the groups, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Again, happy hour on April 9th at North Shore Tavern. There is parking that's really close. Some of it is free on street, some of it is within the parking garage, but you will get free drinks and free food from 6 to 8, or as long as you want to stay at North Shore Tavern before they kick you out. Okay, hope to see you all on the next one. Thanks again.